For 30 years, one of the most famous faces in American television carried a secret that never once slipped past her carefully composed smile. She was the woman who could make a president stammer, a movie star weep, and a disgraced politician confess on live television. Yet the same woman who built an empire out of other people's confessions spent decades guarding a confession of her own, a love affair so dangerous that, had it become public, it might have ended 2 careers at the height of their power. This is the story of Barbara Walters, the barrier-breaking journalist who interrogated the world's most guarded people while hiding one of the best-kept secrets in American media. To understand why Barbara Walters became so skilled at prying open other people's private lives, it helps to look at where she came from. She was born in 1929 in Boston, the daughter of Lou Walters, a colorful and ambitious nightclub impresario who would go on to found the famous Latin Quarter, one of the most glamorous entertainment venues in New York during the 1940s. Barbara grew up literally backstage, surrounded by showgirls, comedians, and entertainers who dazzled audiences under the lights, but who, once the curtain fell, were often exhausted, anxious, and painfully human. That contrast between the polished public performance and the fragile private person left a permanent mark on young Barbara. She learned early that fame was a costume, not a character, and that lesson would shape the way she approached nearly everyone she interviewed for the rest of her life. Her childhood, though glittering on the surface, was far from stable. Her father's fortunes rose and fell dramatically over the years. The family moved between luxury apartments and near financial ruin more than once. Barbara also grew up alongside an older sister who required lifelong care, a responsibility that placed real emotional and financial weight on a young girl who had not yet entered adulthood. These early experiences with instability and responsibility instilled in her a fierce, almost anxious drive to succeed, a fear of returning to insecurity that would push her relentlessly through a career defined by extraordinary highs. Barbara broke into television during an era when the industry was almost entirely run by men who did not believe a woman could deliver serious news. She spent years in supporting roles, writing scripts, producing segments, and generally working just out of camera range, before finally landing a position at NBC's Today show in the early 1960s. Even then, she wasn't hired as a journalist. She was given the dismissive title of Today Girl, expected to handle soft, decorative segments, while her male colleagues covered the news that actually mattered. Critics mocked her voice, which had a distinctive difficulty with certain consonant sounds, and for years she endured public parody rather than professional respect. But Barbara refused to stay in that lane. She pursued serious, substantive stories, built relationships with producers who valued her instincts, and steadily proved she could deliver the kind of reporting her male colleagues were trusted with by default. When the Today Show's longtime host died in 1974, NBC finally promoted her to co-host, making her the first woman in American television history to hold that role on a major network news broadcast. It was a milestone that had taken her more than a decade of quiet, grinding persistence to earn. 2 years later, in 1976, ABC offered her something unheard of, a 5-year, $5 million contract, making her the highest-paid news personality in America at the time, man or woman. It was framed as historic and celebratory in the press, but inside the newsroom, the reaction was closer to open hostility. Her new co-anchor made no secret of his resentment at sharing the desk with a woman, and the broadcast itself suffered from visibly cold, tense chemistry between the two of them. Ratings dipped. Critics piled on, accusing her of being more interested in her paycheck than in journalism. Barbara later described this period as one of the most painful stretches of her professional life. The very fear of failure and financial collapse she had carried since childhood resurfacing under the glare of millions of viewers. Rather than fight for a seat at a desk where she clearly wasn't wanted, Barbara did something few in her position would have dared. She reinvented the format itself. She became a driving force behind a new kind of television, long-form, deeply personal interviews that blended hard news with raw emotional candor. Her primetime specials and her work on the news magazine 2020 became appointment viewing, drawing in audiences who wanted more than headlines. They wanted insight into the human beings behind the headlines. It was in this new arena, freed from the constraints of a traditional anchor desk, that Barbara Walters truly became untouchable. Presidents, dictators, movie stars, and disgraced public figures all eventually sat across from her, because everyone understood that a conversation with Barbara Walters carried weight no other interview could match. Her list of subjects reads like a chronicle of the last half of the 20th century. She secured a joint interview with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin during sensitive peace negotiations. She traveled to Cuba and sat down with Fidel Castro, pressing him directly on the absence of political dissent in his country. She interviewed screen legends who had refused nearly everyone else, coaxing out reflections on fame, loneliness, and regret that those stars had never shared publicly before. And in 1999, her interview with Monica Lewinsky drew more than 70 million viewers, a number that remains one of the largest audiences ever recorded for a news interview in American history. Yet Barbara's interviewing style, for all its power, also drew serious criticism over the years. She had a well-known habit of pressing guests on deeply personal and physical subjects, questions about weight, appearance, and private struggles that many felt crossed the line from probing journalism into something closer to public humiliation. Some of her subjects later admitted that certain moments with her left them feeling genuinely exposed in ways they hadn't consented to. It was the same skill that made her a legendary interviewer, an ability to dismantle a guest's composure, turn toward people who, in hindsight, may not have deserved that kind of scrutiny. It is against this backdrop, a woman who built her entire career on peeling back other people's carefully maintained public images, that her own hidden relationship becomes so striking. Throughout much of the 1970s, while she was rising through the ranks of American broadcast news, Barbara carried on a secret romantic relationship with a sitting United States senator who was already married. The senator was a groundbreaking figure in his own right, a trailblazer whose public career mattered enormously to the causes and communities that had fought to see him elected. Both of them stood at the center of American political and media life, and both understood exactly what exposure would cost them. A scandal of that kind, especially in that era, would not have been treated as a minor tabloid footnote. It would have been treated as a disqualifying event, capable of ending a senator's political career and undoing everything Barbara had spent years building in a newsroom that already doubted her legitimacy. So the relationship stayed hidden. Friends who knew about it reportedly urged her to end things, warning her of exactly how much she stood to lose if the affair ever became public. Barbara herself later admitted that the fear of exposure hung over her for years, a private, constant anxiety that existed in sharp contrast to the fearless, unflinching persona she projected on camera every night. The two of them eventually parted ways, and the secret held. It held through the rest of the senator's political career, through Barbara's rise to the very top of network news, and through decades in which she interviewed presidents and asked other people to bear their own private failures for the cameras. It wasn't until 2008, when she published her memoir Audition, that Barbara chose to reveal the relationship herself, on her own terms, decades after the danger had passed, in a book rather than in front of a camera controlled by someone else. That single choice says a great deal about who Barbara Walters really was. She had spent her career convincing the most guarded people in the world to hand her their secrets. But when it came to her own, she decided precisely when, how, and to whom the truth would be told. It was perhaps the most controlled interview of her life, one in which she was finally both the subject and the interviewer. Her personal life, away from that secret affair, was no less complicated. She was married 4 times to 3 different men, and each marriage eventually collapsed under the weight of a career that left little room for anything else. Her first marriage ended in an annulment after less than a year. Her second, to a theater producer, lasted over a decade and produced her only child, an adopted daughter she named after her own sister. But that marriage, too, gave way to the demands of a career that was rapidly consuming every available hour of her life. Her third and final husband, a television executive, she married and divorced twice, unable to make the relationship last even on a second attempt. Motherhood proved to be one of the most painful threads running through her private life. Barbara's daughter grew up largely raised by nannies, while her mother crisscrossed the globe chasing interviews and headlines. In her memoir, Barbara wrote candidly about calling home from distant assignments just to hear her daughter's voice, and about having staff turn on the television so her daughter could see her mother's face, even if only through a screen. That distance took a toll. Her daughter struggled seriously during her teenage years, and Barbara ultimately made the difficult decision to send her to a residential program for several years. Barbara later spoke publicly and with visible emotion about her daughter's struggles, a choice that drew criticism from some who felt she was exposing her child's private pain the same way she exposed the private pain of her interview subjects. In her later years, however, Barbara worked to repair that relationship, and she wrote candidly and remorsefully about the choices she felt she had gotten wrong as a mother. In 1997, well into her 60s, Barbara once again reinvented herself professionally by co-creating The View, a daytime talk show built around a rotating panel of women debating the issues of the day. It became a massive commercial success and a genuine cultural institution, earning her further industry recognition even as she approached the twilight of her career. But The View also placed her at the center of new controversies, clashes over hiring decisions, on-air disputes among co-hosts, and criticism that she sometimes prioritized ratings and provocation over sensitivity, particularly when guests raised difficult and painful subjects on her show. As she aged, Barbara continued working long after many of her peers had retired, driven by the same restless energy and fear of irrelevance that had pushed her since childhood. She underwent major heart surgery in 2010 and returned to television not long after. She stepped back from her daily hosting duties on The View in 2014, though she continued producing television specials for a few more years. Her very last televised interview came in December 2015, and she made her final public appearance in 2016, after which she withdrew almost entirely from public life. In the years that followed, according to people close to her, Barbara's health quietly declined, and she spent her final years largely out of the public eye. She died at her home in Manhattan on December 30th, 2022, at the age of 93. It was later reported that the words chosen for her memorial reflected exactly the kind of resolve that had defined her entire career, an assertion that she had lived a full life without regret. Barbara Walters spent decades asking other people the questions they least wanted to answer, stripping away the polished exteriors of presidents and film stars alike to find the person underneath. But her own life reveals just how carefully she guarded the line between what the public was allowed to see and what she kept locked away. A hidden love affair with a sitting senator, a string of marriages that couldn't survive her ambition, a daughter raised largely through phone calls and television screens. These were the costs behind the historic contracts and the barrier-breaking headlines. She proved again and again that no one was ever quite as simple as the image projected under studio lights, including, in the end, herself.